Hello and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I will be discussing a hot topic as of late, China versus the United States, and more specifically, I will be describing why China can't surpass the United States in GDP growth. So first, in order to understand why, we must talk about China's demographic challenges. So China has an enormous population, which was the largest in the world until India recently surpassed it. And the Chinese population served as cheap labor for assembling goods that were exported aggressively around the world for years. But it is also one of the countries with the fastest aging populations. By 2040, 27% of Chinese citizens will be over 65, which is up from 15% this year in 2025, and that's a 12% increase. China's labor force, which is ages 14 to 64, will drop from 70 to 64% by 2040. And the UN calculates that China's population will decrease by around 55% in the turn of the next century. A shrinking and aging workforce means reducing the supply of labor and possibility for innovation. In 1970, the average Chinese woman was expected to bear up to 6 children. In 2024, that number fell to around 1. China's population originally skyrocketed in post war decades until its one child policy that was introduced in 1979. The policy limited most families to one child in an effort to control population growth. This caused an issue for women as the cultural preference is sons. In traditional Chinese culture, influenced by Confucian ideals, families highly valued male offspring for carrying on the family name, providing support for families in old age, and performing ancestral rites. So, as a result, baby girls were very unwanted and were often aborted, and if they were somehow born, they were normally abandoned and adopted out of the country. I would like to point out that these actions were not officially sanctioned by the Chinese government, but were the result of individual and family choices driven by the policy and cultural pressure. So, this all leads to a shrinking workforce and obviously a higher dependency ratio, which is more retirees relying on fewer workers. So, I want to talk more about the decline. So, the decline is even more pronounced in top tier cities like Shanghai, where the fertility rate is a mere 0.6%, far below the 2.1% rate that is needed to sustain a population. The US birth rate is actually 1.6, which also falls short, but there remains one key difference, and that's immigration. We'll get into that later and why that's so important. Single and married women across China are receiving cold calls from local authorities encouraging them to have more children. Once there was no right to reproduce Once there was no right to reproductive freedom, and now they are indirectly interfering with your reproductive choices. Decades of economic development have not changed the control over people or the disregard for respect and freedom. One citizen wrote online about the pressure put upon women, and this sentiment is heavily seen online. Like, she's not the only woman saying this. So, originally starting in Japan, and it created traction online, similar to what I just read, posts like that. The 6B4T movement, it consists of women saying no to 6 things, as B sounds like no in the Japanese language. It originally started as the B4 movement, but since they have added 2 things, so now it's the 6B4T movement. These 6 things are boycotting sexist products, renouncing sex, child rearing, dating, and marriage, taking off the corset in a metaphorical sense, rejecting the hypersexualized women of anime, religion, and idol culture. Women are tired of constantly being the victim of misogyny, something that is so normalized in that culture. In fact, China has a history of female infanticide, which is killing females as infants, which spans over 2,000 years. It declined at a certain point during post-war, but there was an uptick again due to the one-child policy. So China has a lot of debt, and they have accumulated a significant amount of debt, particularly in the corporate and real estate sectors. We'll get more into this, but for now, let's just focus on this slide. In the absence of significant fiscal reforms, long-term household consumption growth is likely to slow around 3 to 4% per year in real terms over the next 5 to 10 years. At most, household consumption will contribute around a 1.5 percentage point of GDP growth per year, which is likely to limit overall long-term GDP growth around 3%, which is not good. From an export-centric to a customer-led debt-fueled model in recent years. This model is now at risk. The demographic problem, hard landing of the property sector, heavy local government debt burden, pessimism of the private sector, as well as China-US tensions do not allow us to hold an optimistic view towards mid to long-term growth, said Wang Yun, a chief economist at an asset management firm. Economists no longer contribute weak household consumption and private sector investments to the pandemic's effects. Instead, they're blaming structural ills. Among these structural ills is a mountain of local government debt. Chinese local governments have accumulated substantial debt through off-balance financing vehicles often used to fund infrastructure products and stimulate economic growth, but they are not working. This debt is often opaque and poorly managed, leading to concerns about repayment capacity and potential financial risks. This is a graph that illustrates China's imbalance between consumption and investment by comparing its final consumption expenditure and gross fixed capital formation as a percentage of the GDP compared to other countries. So in orange we have world, blue we have US, dark green we have Japan, and then that light green we have Germany. China's final consumption expenditure as a proportion of GDP is significantly lower than the other countries, hovering around 38% in 2020, while other countries generally range between 50 and 70%. This is indicating that Chinese households spend a relatively smaller portion of the country's economic output compared to their counterparts on other major economies. And then on the right-hand side, we see China's gross fixed capital as a percentage of GDP. And we can see that it's notably higher than the other countries, reaching approximately 42%. The other countries we can see normally have 20 to 30%. And this highlights China's heavy reliance on investment, particularly in property and infrastructure, as a driver of economic growth, while household consumption lags behind. The data underscores the structural imbalance in China's economy, where investment plays a disproportionately large role compared to consumer spending. And I actually found that China's property market accounts for a quarter of output. And that's one of the deepest imbalances between investment and consumption that I found. So now we are getting into political and geopolitical factors. So, as we said a couple slides ago, China has accumulated a significant amount of debt, particularly in the corporate and real estate sectors. High debt levels can lead to financial instability as companies and individuals struggle to repay their debts. This can trigger slowdown in economic growth, with the impact of that being the debt overhang can divert resources away from productive investment and innovations. The corporate sector, including state-owned enterprises, has taken on significant debt to finance investments in infrastructure and expansion. The real estate sector has experienced a boom, with developers borrowing heavily to fund construction projects. This reliance on debt has created vulnerabilities as over-leveraged companies and developers face challenges in servicing their obligations, especially amid economic slowdowns and policy tightenings. The interconnectedness of these sectors means that the financial distress in one area can quickly spread to the others, posing a threat to China's overall economic health. Addressing this debt overhang requires a multifaceted approach, which would include structural reforms and improved risk management. Essentially, these SEOs can be inefficient and are less responsive to market signals than private companies. As much as 70% of Chinese household wealth is tied up in property, and this overinvestment in the property market has led to inflated prices and a risk of the bubble bursting. A collapse in the property market could have severe consequences for the Chinese economy, as it is a major source of wealth and investment. Economists blame structural problems, including the Communist Party's tight grip over society, including private businesses. China's authoritarian political system can stifle innovation and limit economic freedom. Political constraints are hindering economic dynamicism and limit the economy's ability to adapt to changing circumstances. A lack of transparency and accountability can lead to corruption and inefficient resource allocation. So here we can see that China's economy slowed during the pandemic years, and COVID related restrictions in 2022 hit household consumption very hard. Even when the restrictions were lifted in 2023, growth rates stayed really low. Meanwhile, the collapse in China's housing market caused consumers to actively pay down mortgages, reducing debt rather than increasing spending. And we can see here that in Q3 2022 to Q1 2024, we are in the negatives. While the pandemic dampened China's consumption in the early 2020s, the real collapse of the Consumer Confidence Index followed the Shanghai lockdown in 2022, which included controls on mobility throughout the whole country. Even after restrictions were lifted, consumer confidence has barely improved, primarily due to concerns about employment. A survey conducted by the PBOC showed that the average propensity to consume in 2023 has declined by 4 percentage points from 2019 levels, while the propensity to save and deposit increased by 15 percentage points. In another graph that I did not include for time's sake, we can also see that credit card outstanding debt has declined since the end of 2021, as household savings have risen sharply in recent years. Not only are households saving more, but they're placing more savings in time deposits, indicating little intention to spend in the short term and less inclined to borrow. In 2023, there was talk that China's economic growth has given it immense influence over geopolitics in recent decades, and at the end of which will have major implications on the rest of the world. It could mean that trade, finance, and geopolitics could be US centric for longer than expected, but all of that has been brought to a halt with the trade war. So, the US and China trade war has evolved into a complex geopolitical conflict that really extends beyond like the tariffs. Initially sparked by economic grievances, the dispute now encompasses a strategic competition over technical global influence and military posturing. So, under Trump's second term, the US has imposed tariffs as high as 145% on Chinese goods. And of course, in retaliation, we were hit with 125% tariffs on American products. And this escalation really has disrupted global supply chains, leading to shortages and increased costs for consumers and businesses alike. So now we're just going to go into the comparison with the United States, just, wrap it up a little bit. So the US is actively trying to limit China's access to advanced technologies, which could hinder its technological development, While China has advanced in technological innovation, it continues to trail behind the United States in the scale and quality of investment in fundamental research and development. China has achieved or surpassed global leaders in the next gen fields such as commercial nuclear power, quantum communications, and some industrial AI applications. It especially excels in scaling up strategic technologies from initial breakthroughs to mass market deployment, as evident in the green energy and critical minerals, said Lizzie C. Lee, a researcher on the Chinese economy at the Asia Society Policy Institute Center for China's Analysis. So Beijing's position at the forefront of the next technological revolution could be vital to offset these sliding demographic indicators, particularly if it successfully leverages the automation and artificial intelligence. So, Beijing is already a leading player in renewable energy and telecommunications, and their advanced manufacturing base is actually helping green technologies capture untapped markets in the global south. In the near term, business with Chinese companies will continue to feel concerns about intellectual property rights and supply chain resilience, driving US onshoring or friendshoring in allied economies, but America may never truly untangle itself from China. And all that quote is basically saying is that the US government is very hypocritical in the way that they think that China is watching everything they do as they do the same exact thing back. So we can just see here we have United States on the top for gross domestic products, and that's all the way through 2029. Obviously, we can see China and how they really surpassed everybody else in the 2010s, but they're not able to catch up to us. But by at least one popular metric, the Chinese economy is already on top. Chinese purchasing power parity, the relative value of its currency for domestic goods and services, has been higher than that of the US since at least 2017, excuse me. When used to measure defense spending, PPP explains China's lasting industrial might and how it's achieved what Western officials call the largest military buildup in peacetime history. The modernization of the People's Liberation Army naval fleet is being counted in years rather than decades, while China's rocket force could operate 100,000 nuclear warheads by the end of the decade, said a recent US Defense Department assessment. In contrast to absolute comparisons that typically put Beijing's military expenditure at roughly a quarter of the Pentagon's 800 billion bottom line. And a recent PPP based estimate published by the Center for Economic Policy Research in London shows that China spends closer to 2/3 of what America does. So here we're just seeing that China obviously exports way more goods to the rest of the world than the United States does. And with this, you would expect, and this was really why people thought that China was going to surpass the United States, is because of the amount of exports that China was having and the growth that they were having in their economy. So, to wrap it up, we're just gonna do a little comparison between the United States and China. So, obviously, as we discussed, China by 2040, 27% of citizens will be over 65. And in comparison, in 2040, the US population will rise from 347 million to 370 million. And only 22% of that will be senior citizens. Again, similar, but 62% will be of working age, which I believe is greater than China. And the reason we're just seeing all this, it looks very similar, but the only reason that America is really being pushed forward is immigration. America's 47.8 million foreign born residents represented 14.3% of the population in 2023, compared to just 1.4 million immigrants, which is about 0.1% of the Chinese population. The US economy is just way more flexible and adaptable than China's, allowing it to respond quickly to changing global conditions. The younger population and immigration really allows for America to be put ahead. Okay, thanks for watching my video. If you like this video, be sure to go to my LinkedIn and leave a positive comment. Thanks.